All right, so your fantasy football draft is likely coming up, and in this segment, we're not just giving you the rankings, we are giving you the tools to win your league with an innovative new system. So let's bring in the author of the Fantasy Football Black Book, Joe Pisapia. Good to have you in studio. And I was a little hesitant to bring you in, actually, for this. I have to be honest with you, because what you have devised is the system that I feel like I have been using secretly for the past few years to try to win our league, but now you have turned it into a quantifiable measurement called relative position value.
Yes, that's right.
I love the draft strategy that you've used here. Is there any way that you could kind of like summarize what relative position value is?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for not only saying my name so lovely, but also for the kind words as well. Yeah, you know, some people do feel that it is the best kept secret, and it is kind of out. That's kind of the strategy behind the look of the book, too, is the black book, that little black book that you don't want to tell anybody about.
Right.
Eventually, if you do good enough work, then other people start to know about it. But that was kind of the idea behind the brand of the book. But relative position value, what that basically is, it's a system in which I rank players. And it's more important for us to know the value of the player in the system and the value of the player in the league that we're in, and really understand what that means, not just a complete ranking of this player's number 1, this is 2, this is 3. You have to understand how much that player is worth, not just his talent, but his actual talent in the format you play, and that's the separator.
Yeah, and what it's gonna cost you if you pass on this guy, and what it's gonna cost you if you do pick him. Like, in other words, the idea is that every one of your picks is a level of currency.
Correct.
And you want to get the player that is going to give you the proper value. A perfect example would be Rob Gronkowski, a guy who everybody likes to take in the first round, but considering the guys that he's going to, you'd be taking him over at tight end are probably 3 or 4 rounds later, you're not losing as many points if you were to take Jordan Reed or you know, Delaney Walker 3 or 4 rounds later.
Absolutely. What you're getting at is basically the same idea. This relative position value, or RPV, what it is basically a percentage that equates to the fantasy league average and how much better a player is percentage-wise over that average at that position. And a guy like Rob Gronkowski, for instance, like you mentioned, that's a player of substantial value, right? But he's so far and away above everybody else. There's only one team in your league that's going to have that advantage. Everyone else is going to be working towards that rest of that middle grouping of players, and there's not that much separation there. Therefore, you can let a guy like Rob Gronkowski go and end up making hay in tight end other places later on and focus on frontlining, I would say, front-loading wide receivers and other positions like that.
Well, that's the whole point here, because, I mean, let's think about it here. The wide receivers, when you look, there's a reason why the top 3 picks in the drafts are going wide receiver. Right. Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham Jr., Julio Jones. It's because receivers are getting points and receivers aren't getting injured.
Yes.
Okay, so the idea is you want to try to build as many points on your team as possible, so why not front load with wide receivers?
Well, absolutely. What you're touching on right now is the same thing that I think everybody is realizing, which is the injury quotient in the NFL right now for running backs is so high, not to mention the fact that you've got these guys now in systems where they're splitting timeshare carries, where you're worried about week to week who's going to be part of the game plan, and I can understand why people want to shy away from that. The thing that I would say to them is, if you're in a standard league, make sure you focus on that running back still. There's so few and far between bell cow running backs like the Adrian Petersons, like the Todd Gurleys, that they still have value. The trouble is, guys, in PPR leagues and things like that, you can get away with that 0 running back strategy and draft, let's say, Gio Bernard or Duke Johnson or Danny Woodhead later and make up ground in running back and focus on being great somewhere, and that's the wide receiver core.
So you can't forget about running backs early on, but the idea of front-loading on these wide receivers, I mean, look, when you look around the NFL, there's a reason why the NFL has changed their rules to allow for more receptions. They want this game to be faster paced. They want it to be an aerial attack. So why don't we mirror the NFL and focus more on receivers early?
I'll take it a step further. Why don't we mirror the NFL and focus on quarterbacks more?
There you go.
I wish we would actually expand our horizons a little bit and actually bring in the quarterbacks into the league a little bit more. You know, we only draft, what, 12 quarterbacks are starting in a league most of the time. And really, I would say the top 20 quarterbacks are the highest point getters in any league. I'd like to see the whole industry shift to more of a two-quarterback league system or the quarterback as a flex position option.
It would be smart then to take a quarterback early. You want to try to get one of those early
those
quarterbacks.
leagues, absolutely.
There is a great difference between Cam Newton and Andy Dalton.
There is, because of the rushing touchdowns, but also if you front load, see, this is the whole thing with RPV. You have to be great somewhere. You know, you don't want to be average or mediocre everywhere. You want to have a strength, just like every NFL team wants, or just like any MLB team wants. You have to have a strength and figure out what that is. And if you are able to value the talent properly in the format you play and build on that strength, then you have a better chance of everybody else actually losing to you. And that's the whole point. Can you be more productive than everybody else in your league from as many spots as possible?
That's right, because if you're grabbing all of those top-end wide receivers, you're pulling from that pool, and you're making them worse in there as well. Look at some of these running backs that are looking for bounce-back years. Arian Foster, Matt Forte, DeMarco Murray, Melvin Gordon, Eddie Lacy. It seems like some of those guys, if you just stockpile some of those guys, one of them's going to hit, right?
Well, how many of those names killed teams last year? I mean, if you want to talk about how many of those names were disappointments and how many people were throwing things at their television when they had drafted those guys a couple weeks later.
I'm never drafting C.J. Anderson again.
No, you should never, ever do that. I would say this. I think that it's okay and appropriate if you can get them at the right value and the right point in the draft to reach and think that a guy like Arian Foster, who is perennially injured, who is spending more time on the IR than he is spending on the field in the last couple of years, those are guys that can ruin your season. Guys like Gordon, you mentioned, look, they did not make the developmental moves that you wanted to see last year. He wasn't able to pick up, I would say, the pass protection the way they wanted in San Diego. Oliver's out for the year now with a torn ACL. Only Woodhead stands in his way. He probably will get the default volume there, but even so, volume doesn't always necessarily equal points, and you have to keep that in mind.
And speaking of guys, I might pass on Murray because I think that Henry's actually going to be the guy that's going to get a load of the carries there. Let's get into the overrated and underrated. I would like to start off with your overrated players. Who are the guys that are going maybe just a little bit too high?
Well, I think Demaryius Thomas is certainly one of those guys that's overrated right now, especially when you consider the quarterback position right now in Denver. I mean, it is so in flux. We all know Mark Sanchez here in the New York area. I think we've all seen enough of him.
He got no snaps in that game.
Well, that might be the best thing to happen to him.
Right.
Simeon's there. You've got Paxton Lynch there. There's a lot of question marks and not enough answers. And I think whenever you see that, that's a situation worth staying away from. Another one, too, I would say, is the Baltimore running back situation. That's another one you want to avoid altogether. There's just no clarity right now.
Underrated guys. You have Eric Decker and Mark Ingram as your most underrated.
Absolutely. They're incredibly underrated, especially Ingram. Last year, he was much more a part of that passing game in New Orleans, and I think that is a huge, huge bust for his value. I also think that a guy like Ingram, as he's getting older and Drew Brees is getting older along with him, you're going to see them scale back a little bit, get Ingram, I think, a little bit more involved in that offense. And then as far as Decker goes, was there a more consistent fantasy entity last year?
Every single week, 15 points.
Terrific. Whether he's scoring touchdowns or catching balls, just terrific.
Now, for my underrated guys, D'Angelo Williams, I mean, this guy was a beast last year, and Le'Veon Bell isn't going to be coming back. He's probably going to get injured once again. D'Angelo Williams is going somewhere 8-9. You got to grab that guy. And also Marvin Jones in Detroit. You moved from Cincinnati to Detroit. He's starting to look like he's going to be the #1 guy with Stafford there.
Well, he's certainly going to push for it. I think Golden Tate's still going to go into the season as the #1. Tate's really proven he can handle the workload, and you got to love what Stafford did in the second half there. Jim Bob Cooter, you got to love that name, took over running the plays last year in the second half, and that whole offense just took off. I think Detroit is really a team that people are sleeping on offensively.
The book is called The Fantasy Football Black Book. Author and fantasy expert Joe Pisapia, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Steve.